In the winter of 1929, the excavation trench was narrow, damp, and unremarkable. It lay just outside the ancient city of Ur, in what is now southern Iraq, a place already famous for its royal tombs and gold-laden graves. Sir Leonard Woolley had been working there for years, carefully peeling back layers of human occupation, each one telling a familiar story of kings, artisans, servants, and ritual death. By that point, the dig felt routine. Civilization, after all, tends to leave recognizable fingerprints. And then the fingerprints stopped. Beneath the tombs of kings who had ruled 4,000 years earlier, beneath the foundations of temples and houses, Woolley's team reached a layer that did not behave like history usually does. There were no broken pots, no discarded tools, no hearths, no bones, no walls reduced to dust. There was only clay. Clean, compacted clay, laid down by water, stretching for several meters. It was sterile in the strict archaeological sense. No sign that humans had ever lived there at all. At first glance, this might have seemed like a simple geological curiosity. Flooding was common in Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates had always been unpredictable. But the deeper the team dug, the stranger the picture became. Below the clay layer, human life reappeared. Not as a continuation, but as something distinctly different. The pottery styles changed abruptly. The tools followed unfamiliar patterns. The way space had been organized, how people built, stored food, arranged their settlements, no longer matched what lay above. It was as if the site recorded two different worlds, separated not by gradual evolution, but by an interruption. Woolley interpreted the clay as evidence of a great flood, and in the cultural climate of the early 20th century, the idea resonated immediately with biblical narratives. Later research would complicate that interpretation. The flood was not necessarily global, it may not have been singular. There were likely multiple flooding events across different regions and times, but the most unsettling implication of Woolley's discovery remained untouched by these revisions. The people who lived before that layer were not the same people who lived after. Archaeology is accustomed to continuity. Even when empires fall, habits linger. Technologies evolve. Beliefs mutate rather than vanish. But here, the record showed a clean break. A pause, a silence, and then a restart. The excavation notes, now archived in museums in Philadelphia and London, document this transition with meticulous care. They show that what changed was not merely decoration or fashion, but the underlying structure of life itself. How communities organized labor, how they related to land, how they understood permanence. One system ended, another began. This was not simply the story of a city. Similar patterns began to emerge elsewhere, as archaeologists compared notes across continents. Abrupt changes in material culture, settlement, abandonment followed by reoccupation, long gaps where human presence thinned or vanished entirely. Again and again, the deep past seemed to suggest that human history was not a smooth ascent, but a sequence of starts and stops. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest written documents known, describes this pattern in mythic language. Kingship descends from heaven. Antediluvian rulers reign for impossibly long spans of time. Then comes a flood. After it, the length of reigns collapses, shrinking rapidly toward something recognizable as human. Conventional scholarship treats these numbers as symbolic or exaggerated, and that caution is warranted. But the structure of the narrative is striking. History is divided into before and after, a world that ended, a world that followed. If this were only mythology, it might be dismissed as storytelling instinct. Humans everywhere tell stories of beginnings and endings. Yet when mythology is placed beside stratigraphy, beside ice cores, sediment layers, and genetic bottlenecks, an uncomfortable alignment begins to appear. Not perfect, not uncontested, but persistent. The idea that civilizations can end is not controversial. What unsettles is the suggestion that this has happened repeatedly, long before written history began, and that each time something recognizable as civilization organized, knowledgeable, symbolically rich was reduced to fragments. Fragments survive more easily than wholes. Stone lasts longer than wood. Myths last longer than blueprints. Genes last longer than cities. If this hypothesis is correct, then the clay layer at Ur is not merely the record of a flood. It is a boundary between worlds. A reminder that continuity is an illusion created by shallow time. In deeper time, history is punctuated, interrupted, reset. What ended that earlier way of life is still debated. Climate instability, rising waters, regional catastrophe rather than global annihilation, but the mechanism matters less, at least initially, than the pattern. Something happened that the people living there could not adapt to quickly enough. Their settlements vanished, their tools were forgotten, their social structures dissolved. And when humans returned to that landscape, they returned to something else. This is the first quiet suggestion of a cycle. Not a cycle of exact repetition, but of recurring disruption. Civilization forms under favorable conditions. It grows complex. It binds itself to particular climates, coastlines, and rhythms. And then those rhythms change. The evidence does not shout. It whispers from beneath layers of earth. From drowned plains now hidden under shallow seas. from gaps in genetic diversity that appear without warning, from monuments whose builders seem to belong to worlds that should not have existed yet. We tend to imagine ourselves standing at the end of a long, singular story, the latest chapter in a linear progression that began with stone tools and culminated in satellites. But the ground beneath yours suggests a different metaphor, one of pages torn out, of chapters rewritten, of books lost entirely. If there were previous civilizations, and this remains a hypothesis, not a settled fact, then they were not erased cleanly. They ended unevenly. Some people survived, some knowledge persisted, most vanished without trace, and the survivors became the ancestors of those who followed, carrying memories they could no longer fully explain. The clay layer is not dramatic. It contains no ruins, no skeletons, no treasure. Yet it may be one of the most eloquent artifacts humanity has ever uncovered. A mute testimony that a world once stood where another would later rise, that the familiar has been replaced before, that endings can look, in the ground, like silence. From that silence, history begins again. If the clay beneath you suggests an ending written in water, the next rupture in human history appears to have been written in fire. Not the slow, familiar fire of hearths and controlled burns, but something sudden, violent, and possibly arriving from above. Around 12,800 years ago, at the close of the last ice age, the Earth entered a climatic reversal so abrupt that even today it unsettles researchers who study it. This period is known as the Younger Dryas. For thousands of years before it began, the planet had been warming steadily. Ice sheets were retreating, ecosystems were expanding, human populations were spreading into new territories, adapting to landscapes that were becoming increasingly hospitable. Then, within what may have been only a few decades, that trend stopped. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere plunged. In some regions, average conditions cooled by as much as 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Glaciers that had been melting began to advance again. Plant communities collapsed. Animal populations that had survived the ice age itself vanished shortly afterward. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dozens of other large species disappeared from the fossil record in a geological instant. Human cultures did not escape this disruption. In North America, the Clovis culture, defined by its distinctive fluted stone, points in once thought to represent the continent's earliest inhabitants, vanishes at almost exactly the same boundary. Archaeological sites show a sharp break. The tools change. Settlement patterns shift. The old ways do not continue. Something fundamental was lost. What caused this sudden reversal remains debated. One hypothesis proposes that fragments of a comet or asteroid struck or exploded in Earth's atmosphere, triggering massive wildfires, injecting dust into the air, and disrupting climate systems already in a delicate balance. Proponents point to a thin boundary layer found at sites across North America, Europe, and parts of the Near East, often called the Black Mat. Within this layer, researchers have reported unusual concentrations of materials such as nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, melted glass, and elevated platinum levels. If this interpretation is correct, these materials would suggest extreme temperatures and pressures consistent with cosmic impacts. Yet this remains contested. Other scientists argue that similar markers can be produced by terrestrial processes, wildfires, volcanic activity, or misidentified minerals. Some studies have failed to replicate the findings. Others question whether the materials found are truly synchronous across continents. The scientific debate is ongoing, unresolved, and often contentious. What is not debated is the reality of the climatic shock itself. Ice cores from Greenland show a clear signal. Lake sediments record abrupt ecological change. Pollen data reveal vegetation collapse. Whatever triggered the Younger Dryas, its effects were global in scope. For human societies, the consequences would have been immediate and devastating. Communities adapted to warming environments suddenly found themselves facing cold, drought, and resource scarcity. Migration routes closed as ice returned. Food webs unraveled. Knowledge finely tuned to one set of conditions became dangerously obsolete under another. Survival favored flexibility, luck, and geography. Some groups disappeared entirely. Others fractured into smaller, more mobile bands. And a few, perhaps by chance, found refuge in regions less severely affected. It is within this context that certain archaeological anomalies take on new significance. In southeastern Anatolia stands Göbekli Tepe, a site dated to shortly after the onset of the Younger Dryas. Massive T-shaped stone pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, arranged in circular enclosures. Carvings of animals, foxes, snakes, birds, boars executed with a confidence and symbolic depth that seems out of place in a world supposedly populated only by simple hunter-gatherers. There is no clear evidence of agriculture at the site's earliest phases. No domesticated plants, no herded animals. And yet, the scale of construction implies organized labor, planning, and shared purpose extending over years, perhaps decades. Why build such monuments at such a time? One interpretation suggests that Göbekli Tepe represents a sanctuary, a ritual center drawing dispersed populations together. Another, more speculative, sees it as something else entirely, an attempt to preserve knowledge, to mark the sky, to encode memory in stone when other forms of transmission had failed. If the Younger Dryas catastrophe destroyed an earlier way of life, then Göbekli Tepe may be part of the response to that destruction. Not evidence of a lost technological civilization, but of a lost continuity. A society that remembered something important had ended, and sought to anchor meaning in materials that might outlast climate and catastrophe. This interpretation is not proven, it may never be, but it aligns with a recurring pattern. After disruption, humans often turn to monumentality, two durable symbols, two structures meant to endure when memory alone is no longer trusted. Fire from the sky, if it occurred, would not have spared those with the most knowledge or the greatest achievements. It would have selected randomly, favoring neither wisdom nor power. The survivors would have been those in sheltered locations, those far from the worst effects, or those whose skills happened to remain useful in a radically altered world. From those survivors, the next phase of human history emerged. The Younger Dryas did not erase humanity, but it may have erased a version of it, a configuration of culture, environment, and expectation that could not survive abrupt change. What followed was not a continuation, but a reorganization. If this was the first of several civilizational ruptures, it establishes a pattern that will repeat. Not identical catastrophes, but different stresses, exploiting different vulnerabilities. Fire this time, water next, then cold, drought, social collapse, and silent transformations that leave no ruins at all. The stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe stand at the edge of this transition, half memory, half warning. They suggest that even in deep prehistory, humans understood that worlds could end, and that something worth carrying forward might be lost if it were not deliberately preserved. The fire, if it fell, did more than burn landscapes. It severed a continuity. And from that break, a new human story began to assemble itself from fragments. If fire marked the end of one world, water would quietly erase another. Not with a single catastrophic wave, but through a slow, relentless advance that unfolded over generations. As the climate recovered from the Younger Dryas and the great ice sheets began to melt in earnest, the oceans rose. At first, almost imperceptibly, then faster, then fast enough that people could watch familiar landscapes disappear within a lifetime. At the height of the last glacial maximum, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today. Vast expanses of land now hidden beneath shallow seas were once open plains, river valleys, wetlands, and fertile coastal corridors. These were not marginal environments. They were among the richest ecological zones on the planet. Freshwater rivers met the sea. Fish migrated in dense seasonal runs. Shellfish could be gathered in abundance. Wild plants thrived in soils replenished by flooding and sediment. For human societies transitioning toward more sedentary lifeways, these coasts offered everything needed for stability without agriculture. Protein was reliable. Mobility was optional. Populations could grow dense without exhausting resources. If early complex societies existed anywhere before the rise of farming, these drowned landscapes are where they would most likely have been, and they are gone. In northern Europe, the region known as Doggerland once connected Britain to the continent. It was a low-lying world of forests, rivers, lakes, and marshes, supporting human communities for thousands of years. Stone tools, worked bone, and even human remains have been dredged up from the seabed by fishing trawlers. Submerged forests still stand beneath the North Sea, their roots fixed in soils now buried under meters of water. Further south, the Persian Gulf was once a broad river basin. During the Ice Age, the combined waters of the Tigris and Euphrates flowed across what is now open sea, creating a fertile corridor bounded by mountains on both sides. As sea levels rose, this basin flooded slowly, transforming dry land into estuaries, then shallow seas, and finally the Gulf as we know it today. In Southeast Asia, an even larger landmass vanished. Sundaland connected present-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and surrounding regions into a single continental extension of Asia. When the seas rose, more than 1 million square kilometers of habitable land were lost. The scale of displacement would have been immense. What happened to the people who lived there? The archaeological record is fragmentary, not because these societies did not exist, but because their homes are now underwater. Marine archaeology has only begun to scratch the surface of these submerged worlds. What little we know suggests organized settlement, long-term occupation, and deep familiarity with coastal ecosystems. As the seas advanced, communities retreated inland, not all at once, not in panic, but steadily, generation by generation. Shorelines moved, fishing grounds vanished, sacred sites were claimed by water, burial grounds were abandoned. The loss was cumulative, and by the time it was complete, entire ways of life had disappeared. This kind of catastrophe behaves differently from sudden disaster. It leaves survivors, many of them, and because it unfolds slowly, it allows memory to form. This is where flood myths enter the story. From Mesopotamia to the Hebrew Bible, from South Asia to the Americas, stories of rising waters recur with striking consistency. A world drowned, a chosen survivor warned in advance, knowledge preserved, a new beginning after the waters recede. These narratives differ in detail, but they share a common structure. It is tempting to dismiss them as symbolic, and symbolism is certainly present, but symbolism does not preclude memory. A slow generational flood would have been experienced not as a single event, but as a curse that never ended. Each generation would have known a smaller world than the one before. Each would have debated causes, meanings, and responses. Rituals would have formed, stories would have accumulated. Eventually, the memory of gradual loss could compress into the image of a single, overwhelming deluge. If this hypothesis is correct, then flood myths are not records of one disaster, but echoes of many, layered and simplified by time. The cultural consequences of this drowning were profound. Inland regions that had previously been peripheral became refuges. River valleys filled with displaced populations carrying knowledge shaped by coastal abundance. In southern Mesopotamia, the sudden appearance of sophisticated cultural traditions, advanced pottery, architecture, and social organization has long puzzled archaeologists. Rather than representing spontaneous invention, these may reflect inheritance. The transfer of accumulated skills from landscapes that no longer exist. What vanished beneath the waves was not necessarily humanity's first attempt at complexity, but its most archaeologically invisible one. Unlike stone monuments on dry land, coastal societies leave little that survives inundation wood rots. Fiber dissolves, even stone can be scattered by currents and buried under sediment. The absence of evidence, in this case, is not evidence of absence. It is a consequence of preservation bias, written at planetary scale. Those who survived the drowning world did not rebuild it, they adapted to something new. They turned inland. They learned to farm. They reorganized around rivers rather than tides. And in doing so, they carried forward memories of a time when the sea had been both provider and destroyer. This was not the end of civilization, if civilization is understood broadly, but it was the end of a particular configuration of human life, one bound to coasts that no longer exist, a world whose geography has been erased so completely that even its outline must be reconstructed through models and speculation. The water did not kill everyone. It selected for those who could move, who could change, who could let go. And from those survivors, another stage of human history began to take shape, shaped now by land scarcity, fixed fields, and the growing dependence on seasonal rains. The drowning of the first shores did not announce itself with fire or noise. It crept forward, quietly, until there was nowhere left to stand. And when it was done, the map of the world and of human possibility had been permanently redrawn. The world that emerged after the seas stabilized was shaped by a new promise. Rain would come, seeds would grow. Fields would provide what coasts no longer could. For a time, this promise held. Across the Near East, communities settled more permanently, experimenting with cultivation and storage, building villages that no longer needed to move with the seasons. Human life began to organize itself around expectation. And then the expectations failed. Around 8,200 years ago, the climate system of the North Atlantic shifted abruptly. Ice core records from Greenland reveal a sudden drop in temperature, sharp enough to stand out even against the noise of millennia. Lake sediments across Europe, the Near East, and parts of Africa record drought conditions that persisted not for years, but for centuries. Tree rings narrow, pollen signatures change, rivers shrink. The rains did not stop entirely, but they became unreliable, arriving late, weak, or not at all. This event, known as the 8.2 kiloyear climate anomaly, appears to have been triggered by the catastrophic release of glacial meltwater from proglacial lakes in North America. When immense volumes of cold fresh water poured into the North Atlantic, they disrupted ocean circulation patterns responsible for distributing heat across the hemisphere. The result was rapid cooling and widespread climatic instability. For societies newly dependent on rainfall, the effect was devastating. The early farming communities of the Near East had flourished under relatively stable conditions. Their crops relied on predictable precipitation rather than engineered irrigation. Their storage systems assumed seasonal regularity. Their social structures, rituals, and population densities were calibrated to a climate that no longer existed. Archaeological sites across the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia tell the same story. Settlements shrink. Some are abandoned entirely. Others show evidence of dietary stress, changes in subsistence strategies, and declining population. Places that had been occupied continuously for centuries suddenly fall silent. Jericho, one of the earliest known walled settlements, shows disruption. Ain Ghazal, once home to thousands, declines sharply before being deserted. Kaytalyuk, that dense and symbolically rich community in Anatolia, undergoes a profound transformation. The eastern mound, long occupied, is abandoned, and the settlement shifts west, accompanied by changes in architecture, economy, and social organization. This was not collapse in the dramatic sense of fire and ruin. It was erosion, a gradual unraveling of systems that no longer worked. The vulnerability lay not in ignorance, but in success. These communities had optimized themselves for a narrow climatic window. When that window closed, flexibility mattered more than tradition. Those who depended entirely on rain-fed agriculture faced impossible choices: starve, migrate, or adapt beyond recognition. Some groups survived by moving closer to permanent water sources. Rivers became lifelines. Springs and wetlands turned into refuges. Others adopted more mobile lifestyles, combining limited cultivation with herding or foraging. The map of human settlement tightened around reliable water, and in doing so, it laid the foundations for something new. The great river civilizations did not arise simply because rivers were convenient. They arose because, during crisis, rivers were survivable. The Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates offered a form of stability that rainfall could not. Even in drought years, they flowed. Their floods, though sometimes destructive, were at least predictable. Along their banks, agriculture could be managed rather than hoped for. Irrigation systems replaced prayer. Calendars replaced guesswork. If this hypothesis is correct, then the 8.2 kiloyear event did more than disrupt early farming. It selected for a particular way of organizing society. Centralized water management, coordinated labor, authority capable of mobilizing communities to build canals and maintain fields. The seeds of hierarchy were planted in the soil of necessity. Much was lost in this transition. The elaborate artistic traditions of the pre-pottery Neolithic fade. Monumental communal spaces disappear. Settlement sizes shrink. Knowledge that required surplus and leisure becomes impossible to sustain under stress. Yet something endured. The survivors carried with them not only genes, but lessons. They learned that climate could change abruptly, that reliance on a single system was dangerous, that survival favored those who could read patterns and respond collectively. These lessons would shape the civilizations that followed, even if their origins were forgotten. In later mythologies, this period is rarely remembered directly. There is no single flood hero, no dramatic fire from heaven. Instead, there are stories of famine, wandering, and divine withdrawal. Gods who no longer send rain. Lands cursed by dryness. Peoples forced to leave their homes in search of sustenance. These stories may reflect not one event, but the memory of a long betrayal, a time when the sky itself became unreliable. The rains had once enabled a new way of life. When they failed, that way of life failed with them. Civilization did not end, but it was reshaped, narrowed, and hardened. From dispersed villages emerged concentrated populations bound to rivers, dependent on coordination and control. The 8.2 kiloyear event marks a subtle but profound boundary, not the destruction of humanity's achievements, but the end of an experiment, a reminder that complexity built on fragile assumptions cannot endure without adaptation. Another world faded, not in flames or waves, but in the quiet absence of rain. Long before the Sahara became a synonym for emptiness, it was a living world. Lakes shimmered where salt flats now stretched to the horizon. Rivers cut through grasslands rich with wildlife. Cattle grazed where dunes would later rise. For thousands of years, human communities adapted not to scarcity, but to abundance, shaping their lives around seasonal rains that transformed the landscape into a mosaic of water, pasture, and forest. This was not a marginal frontier. It was a core habitat. Rock art scattered across what is now one of the harshest environments on Earth preserves scenes that no desert could support. Hunters pursue elephants and rhinoceroses. Fishermen cast nets into lakes that no longer exist. Later images show herders guiding cattle, participating in ceremonies, watching the sky. These were not fleeting visits. They were records of settled, repeated life. The climate that made this possible was driven by orbital rhythms. During the early and middle Holocene, Earth's axial tilt intensified the African monsoon, pushing rainfall far north of its modern limits. Summer storms replenished lakes and sustained vegetation. The Sahara was green, and human societies flourished within it. Then the rhythm shifted. As orbital configurations changed, the monsoon weakened, rains retreated southward. At first, the change may have seemed manageable. Seasons shortened, lakes shrank, pastures thinned. But the system contained a hidden instability. Vegetation did more than respond to rainfall, it helped create it. Plants recycled moisture into the atmosphere, sustaining local precipitation. When vegetation cover declined below a critical threshold, that feedback collapsed. What followed was not gradual decline, but rapid transformation. Within a few centuries perhaps, within only a handful of generations, vast regions crossed an irreversible tipping point. Grasslands failed. Lakes evaporated, soils eroded. Winds stripped away what little moisture remained. The green Sahara died, and in its place emerged the desert we recognize today. For the people who lived there, this was not an abstract climate trend. It was the disappearance of their world. Archaeological sites record the response. Cemeteries show continuity for centuries, then stop. Settlements thin, then vanish. Tools and ceramics appear briefly in new regions and then move again, tracing paths of migration driven not by conquest, but by thirst. Entire populations were forced to choose between adaptation and extinction. Many moved toward permanent water. The Nile Valley, already inhabited, experienced a dramatic influx. The timing is suggestive. In the millennia following Saharan desiccation, population density along the Nile increased sharply. Cultural complexity accelerated. Social hierarchies formed. Monumental construction began to appear. If this hypothesis is correct, then Egyptian civilization did not arise in isolation. It was shaped, in part, by refugees from a dying world. These Saharan populations carried more than bodies. They carried knowledge accumulated over generations of living in open landscapes under vast skies. They understood seasonal cycles. They tracked stars. They managed herds across large territories. Their social organization had to coordinate movement, ritual, and resource sharing in an unpredictable environment. Some of that knowledge appears to echo in early Egyptian culture, the prominence of cattle in religious symbolism, the importance of celestial alignment in ritual architecture, the emphasis on order imposed upon chaos. These may not be inventions ex nihilo, but adaptations of inherited frameworks applied to a new ecological context. Sites deep in the Nubian desert hint at this continuity. Stone circles aligned to solar events suggest systematic astronomical observation long before the pyramids. Ritual spaces imply organized belief systems capable of mobilizing labor. These places were abandoned when the water table fell too far. Their builders forced onward, but the ideas they embodied did not disappear. The death of the Green Sahara was not merely an environmental shift, it was a civilizational filter. Those who survived did so by relocating to environments where control could replace dependence. In river valleys, irrigation could compensate for lost rainfall. Predictable flooding could be measured, taxed, and managed. Authority became possible because water could be regulated. Kingship, in this light, was not simply an expression of power, but a response to ecological trauma. What was lost, however, was immense. A way of life adapted to wide, open, seasonal abundance vanished. Artistic traditions tied to that landscape ended. Oral histories rooted in lakes and pastures became obsolete. Memory had to be reshaped to fit new surroundings. In later myths, this loss appears indirectly. Stories of wandering ancestors, of lands that dried and drove people away, of divine order established after chaos. Rarely is the desert itself remembered as a former paradise. The transformation was complete, to final. The Sahara did not burn, it did not flood, it simply stopped giving. And when it did, a civilization tuned to its rhythms could no longer exist. From its collapse emerged something new, more centralized, more controlled, and ultimately more durable in stone. But beneath the monuments of later ages lies the shadow of a vanished green world, whose people once believed that the rains would always return. They did not. By the time the Sahara had turned to dust, human societies had learned a new lesson. Survival no longer depended only on adapting to local conditions, but on managing relationships across distance. Trade routes stretched between regions with different resources. Metals moved from mountains to plains. Timber traveled from forests to river valleys. Grain flowed from surplus zones to cities that no longer fed themselves. For the first time, civilization became interconnected. This interconnection brought extraordinary power. It allowed cities to grow far beyond what their immediate environments could sustain. It supported specialization, administration, and the accumulation of wealth. But it also introduced a new vulnerability. When systems are linked, failure rarely remains local. Around 4,200 years ago, that vulnerability was exposed. Across a vast swath of the Old World, climatic conditions shifted again. Evidence preserved in lake sediments, cave formations, marine cores, and ancient soils points to a prolonged period of drought and instability. Rainfall declined sharply in regions dependent on seasonal precipitation. Winds intensified, carrying dust from desiccated landscapes into once fertile zones. Fields failed not once, but repeatedly, year after year. For societies already operating near the limits of their ecological margins, this was catastrophic. In northern Mesopotamia, rain-fed agriculture collapsed. Major urban centers were abandoned without signs of invasion or destruction. Streets filled with wind-blown dust. Storage facilities stood empty. The land itself ceased to support settled farming for generations. These were not cities burned by enemies. They were cities emptied by hunger. The Akkadian Empire, the first political entity to unite much of Mesopotamia under centralized rule, disintegrated rapidly. Its administrative system, once capable of moving grain and manpower across regions, proved brittle under sustained stress. As northern territories failed, refugees poured south into irrigated lands already stretched thin. The state could no longer provide. Authority fragmented, the empire dissolved. In Egypt, the same climatic disruption manifested differently but no less severely. The Nile's floods became erratic. Years of low inundation followed one another, undermining the agricultural surplus that had supported pyramid building and centralized rule. The Old Kingdom collapsed into famine, regional autonomy, and social unrest. Texts from the period speak of hunger, chaos, and the inversion of social order. Further east, the Indus Valley civilization entered a long decline. Its great cities were not destroyed in a single moment, but gradually depopulated as monsoon patterns shifted and river systems changed course. Populations dispersed eastward, abandoning dense urban life for smaller, more flexible settlements. The knowledge embedded in standardized urban planning and water management was not lost immediately, but it was no longer reproduced at scale. Even in China, where climatic effects took different forms, disruption followed. In some regions, drought dominated. In others, excessive rainfall overwhelmed engineered systems. The pattern was not uniform, but the outcome was similar. Complex societies built for stability struggled when stability vanished. What unites these collapses is not a single cause, but a cascade. Climate stress reduced agricultural output. Reduced output triggered famine. Famine drove migration. Migration destabilized political systems. Conflict followed scarcity. Trade networks broke. Specialized production ceased. The interdependence that had once amplified prosperity now amplified failure. This was not the end of civilization everywhere. It was the end of a particular configuration, large, tightly connected, resource-intensive states dependent on predictable climate and long-distance exchange. Those who survived did so by becoming smaller, more local, and more resilient. Some shifted to pastoral nomadism, following water and grazing rather than fixed fields. Others retreated into regions where irrigation could buffer drought. Still others fragmented into communities that no longer relied on distant partners. The Bronze Age world did not collapse because its people lacked intelligence or skill. It collapsed because complexity, once achieved, creates inertia. Systems optimized for efficiency resist change. When conditions move outside the range they were built to handle, adaptation becomes slow, and delay becomes fatal. This is a crucial distinction. Collapse does not require failure at every level. It requires failure at the points of connection. If this hypothesis is correct, then the fifth civilizational rupture was not a singular disaster, but a lesson in systemic fragility, a demonstration that interconnection, while powerful, carries hidden costs. The more a society depends on what lies beyond its borders, the more vulnerable it becomes to forces it cannot control. In myth, this period is remembered obliquely. Stories of fallen ages, of kings who lost favor, of lands that could no longer feed their people. There is rarely a single villain. The blame is diffuse, spread across gods, fate, or moral decay. Yet beneath these narratives lies a simpler truth. The environment changed, and the systems built upon it failed to keep pace. After the collapse, history narrows again. Writing disappears in some regions. Monumental architecture pauses. Population densities fall. For centuries, the archaeological record thins. This is sometimes called a dark age, but darkness here does not imply ignorance, it implies dispersal. Knowledge survives in fragments, carried by communities too small to leave grand ruins. Eventually, new states emerge. New networks form, but they are not the same as what came before. The world after the collapse is more cautious, more regional, and more aware at least implicitly that abundance can vanish. The fifth rupture reveals a new dimension of vulnerability. Not fire, not flood, not drought alone, but the interaction between environment and connectivity. A reminder that when civilizations grow beyond local limits, they tie their fate to forces operating at planetary scale. What followed would be quieter still. A transformation that left no collapsed cities, no abandoned monuments, no dramatic sediment layers. Yet its imprint would be written into the human genome itself. Not every civilizational rupture announces itself with ruins. Some leave no burned cities, no abandoned temples, no layers of dust in the streets. They pass almost invisibly through the archaeological record, detectable only much later, when new tools make it possible to read evidence written not in stone, but in blood. One such rupture appears to have occurred between roughly 5,000 and 3,000 years ago. It left no obvious scars on the landscape. Yet it reshaped human societies so profoundly that the civilizations we recognize as ancient history emerged directly from its aftermath. The evidence comes from genetics. When researchers began analyzing Y chromosome diversity in modern and ancient human populations, they noticed something unexpected. Across Africa, Europe, and much of Asia, the number of distinct male lineages collapsed dramatically during this period. Statistical models suggest that, for a time, the effective population of reproducing males shrank to a fraction of what would be expected based on overall population size. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, showed no comparable bottleneck. This asymmetry is crucial. It implies not a general population crash, but a selective loss of male lines. Something was happening that disproportionately prevented men from passing on their genes, while women continued to do so. What caused this remains debated. One hypothesis points to violent competition between patrilineal clans. In societies where men remain with their birth group and women marry out, all males within a clan carry closely related Y chromosomes. When conflict eliminates an entire clan, its male genetic signature disappears instantly. Women taken into victorious groups preserve mitochondrial diversity while contributing nothing to Y chromosome variation. Over time, repeated episodes of such conflict could drastically narrow male lineages without requiring mass extinction. Another explanation focuses on social stratification rather than warfare. In increasingly hierarchical societies, a small number of elite men may have monopolized reproductive success. Kings, chiefs, and powerful lineage heads could father many children, while large numbers of lower status men left none. Over generations, this reproductive inequality alone could produce the observed genetic pattern, even in the absence of widespread violence. More recent models suggest an even quieter mechanism. In strictly patrilineal systems, ordinary demographic processes, clan fission, founder effects, and random drift can gradually concentrate Y chromosome diversity into fewer surviving lines. No catastrophe is required, no massacre, just social rules governing descent and inheritance operating over centuries. Whichever mechanism dominated, the outcome appears consistent. A world of relatively egalitarian, diverse male lineages gave way to one in which ancestry, property, and power flowed through far narrower channels. This genetic bottleneck coincides with a broader transformation visible in archaeology. During the same period, societies across Eurasia shifted toward stronger patriarchy, inherited status, territorial control, and organized warfare. Lineage mattered more, boundaries hardened, social mobility declined. The stage was set for kingdoms and empires. If this hypothesis is correct, then the sixth civilizational rupture was not environmental, but structural. Earlier societies may have collapsed because the climate betrayed them, or the seas rose, or rains failed. This time, the rupture occurred because humans reorganized themselves in ways that favored some lineages over others. The world did not end. It narrowed. From the survivors of this narrowing emerged the civilizations that left the first extensive written records. Sumerian city-states developed bureaucracies and monumental architecture. Egypt unified under dynastic rule. The Indus Valley organized its cities with remarkable standardization. Early Chinese cultures consolidated power along river systems. These societies were capable of mobilizing labor, enforcing hierarchy, and maintaining continuity across generations. They were also built on exclusion. The same social structures that enabled large-scale coordination likely contributed to the genetic pattern. Patrilineal descent simplified inheritance, concentrated authority, stabilized governance, reproductive success aligned with power. Civilization, in this sense, became efficient by becoming unequal. This transformation leaves little trace in myth. There is no flood hero, no fire from heaven. Instead, there are genealogies, long lists of fathers and sons. Kings tracing descent from gods or legendary ancestors. The emphasis on lineage itself may be a cultural echo of the bottleneck that made lineage decisive. The quiet vanishing of fathers did not destroy humanity's achievements. It reorganized them. It determined who would inherit the future and who would not. And because it operated through social rules rather than physical catastrophe, it was invisible to those living through it. Yet its effects persist. Modern populations still carry the genetic signature of this narrowing. A surprisingly small number of male ancestors account for a large proportion of living men. Civilization as we know it is built not only on monuments and texts, but on demographic filters that selected which lines would continue. This was not the end of a world in the traditional sense. It was the end of many possible worlds, collapsed into one dominant configuration. And from that configuration, history accelerated. By the time writing appears, the narrowing is already complete. The sixth rupture has passed. What follows is the familiar terrain of ancient history, emerging from a population shaped as much by social selection as by survival. The earlier catastrophes were written into earth and water. This one was written into inheritance itself. When physical evidence fades, memory does not vanish with it. It changes shape. Across the world, cultures separated by oceans and millennia tell strikingly similar stories. They speak of earlier worlds that ended, of ages destroyed by fire, by water, by ice, by darkness, of survivors warned in advance, guided by divine beings, or preserved through knowledge that others lacked. These narratives are often dismissed as coincidence or symbolism, and in many ways they are. Yet their persistence raises an uncomfortable question. Why do so many traditions insist that the present world is not the first? The Sumerians divided history into before and after the flood. Hindu cosmology describes successive world ages, each ending in devastation, with the present age counted not as the beginning, but as the continuation of a long cycle. The Hopi speak of previous worlds destroyed by different forces before the emergence into the current one. Mesoamerican traditions describe multiple suns, each ending catastrophically. Norse mythology frames creation and destruction as an endless loop, with the current world rising from the ruins of another and destined to fall in turn. These stories do not align in detail. They do not need to. What they share is structure. Each tradition encodes a sequence. An earlier order exists. It collapses through forces beyond human control. A remnant survives. The survivors carry something forward: law, ritual, seed, language, memory, and, from that fragment, a new world is built. The repetition itself is the message. It would be easy to argue that humans naturally think in cycles. Seasons repeat, generations rise and fall. Death is followed by birth. Myths, in this view, simply mirror psychological patterns. This explanation is plausible, but incomplete. Cyclical thinking does not require specificity, yet many traditions enumerate the number of previous worlds. They assign each a particular mode of destruction: fire, flood, wind, ice. These details recur with surprising consistency. If these myths were merely symbolic, why do they so often mirror the categories of catastrophe visible in the geological and archaeological record? This does not mean myth is history. It means myth may be memory, compressed and distorted by time. Oral traditions are not static. They are edited with each retelling. Details that no longer make sense are replaced with metaphor. Causes are moralized. Human agency is projected onto natural forces. Gods take the place of climate systems. Yet the underlying structure can persist for astonishing lengths of time. A gradual sea level rise remembered across generations may become a single great flood. A prolonged drought may be reframed as divine punishment. A sudden cooling event may become fire from the sky or the withdrawal of the sun. Memory simplifies in order to survive. If this hypothesis is correct, then mythology functions as a low-resolution archive. It does not preserve precise dates or mechanisms. It preserves pattern. It preserves the knowledge that worlds can end, that survival is uneven, and that continuity is fragile. This interpretation remains controversial. Critics argue that similarities between myths reflect cultural diffusion rather than shared experience. Flood stories, for example, could have spread outward from a single source culture through trade and migration. Others suggest that humans everywhere face local disasters, and similar stories arise independently as responses to universal fears. These objections carry weight. Diffusion is real. Psychology matters. Yet neither explanation fully accounts for the global distribution of multi-age cosmologies, especially in regions with little direct contact. Nor do they explain why mythic cycles often align so closely with periods of known environmental instability. The absence of proof cuts both ways. Myth cannot confirm catastrophe, but neither can it be dismissed as meaningless noise. What emerges instead is a cautious possibility that myth preserves not facts, but orientation, a cultural posture toward impermanence, a warning encoded not in data, but in narrative. Civilizations end, survivors rebuild, memory degrades, and then the cycle repeats. From this perspective, myth is not a claim about the past. It is a preparation for the future. By telling stories of destroyed worlds, cultures remind themselves that continuity is conditional, that the present order is not guaranteed, that survival may require adaptation rather than loyalty to tradition. In this sense, myth performs the same function as monumentality or genealogy. It anchors identity across rupture. The people who told these stories did not know about ice cores or orbital forcing or genetic bottlenecks. They did not need to. What they knew was that the world they inhabited had not always been the way it was, that something fundamental had changed, and that those who failed to change with it did not survive. Whether myth reflects distorted memory of real catastrophes or convergent imagination shaped by shared human vulnerability remains unresolved. Perhaps both are true. Memory and meaning are not mutually exclusive. What matters for the present narrative is not proof, but alignment. When geological layers, archaeological discontinuities, genetic signals, and mythic structures all point in the same direction, even imperfectly, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The past, it seems, keeps telling the same story. Not loudly, not clearly, but persistently. And the story is not about gods or heroes. It is about fragility. When the fragments are laid side by side, a shape begins to emerge. Not a precise diagram, not a timeline that can be measured cleanly in years and dates, but a recurring pattern that becomes visible only when deep time is allowed to speak. Fire, water, cold, drought, collapse, silence, each disruption different in mechanism, yet similar in consequence. Each one followed by survival, adaptation, and rebuilding. And now, standing at the end of this sequence, there is us. The seventh. What distinguishes the present age is not simply technology, but awareness. For the first time, a civilization exists that can identify the mechanisms that ended previous worlds. We can read ice cores and see the sudden cooling of the younger Dryas. We can model sea level rise and reconstruct drowned coastlines. We can trace pollen records that chart the death of the Green Sahara. We can detect drought signatures in cave formations and genetic bottlenecks in DNA itself. We are not guessing blindly. We are looking at the evidence left behind. And yet, this awareness introduces a new tension. Knowledge alone does not confer immunity. In some ways, it increases vulnerability. Earlier societies did not know precisely what threatened them, but neither were they dependent on systems whose failure could cascade globally. Our civilization is. Modern life is built on interconnection far denser than anything that existed during the Bronze Age. Food systems depend on fossil fuels, synthetic fertilizers, global shipping, and stable climate patterns. Medicine relies on complex supply chains and continuous electrical power. Communication, finance, governance, and even memory itself are increasingly mediated through digital infrastructure that requires constant maintenance. The same connectivity that enables extraordinary efficiency also creates a single, shared failure mode. If one region fails today, the effects do not remain local. They propagate instantly through markets, logistics, and information systems. A drought in one continent can affect food prices worldwide. A disruption to energy supply can paralyze economies thousands of kilometers away. The buffering effect of geographic separation that helped previous civilizations survive regional collapse has largely disappeared. This is the seventh pattern's defining feature. Unlike earlier ages, the dominant threats we face are not solely external. Climate change, accelerated by human activity, mirrors past disruptions but operates on faster timescales. Atmospheric carbon levels are rising more rapidly than during any known natural transition in the period of human civilization. Rainfall patterns are shifting, Coastlines are again at risk, not over millennia, but within centuries. Pandemic disease, once constrained by distance and time, now spreads through global networks in weeks. The same conditions that make modern cities efficient also make them vulnerable to contagion. Recent events have demonstrated how quickly complex systems can stall when biological threats intersect with economic interdependence. Beyond these familiar hazards lie threats with no prehistoric precedent. Nuclear weapons compress civilizational destruction into hours rather than generations. Biotechnology enables the creation of pathogens more lethal than those shaped by natural evolution. Artificial intelligence systems, growing in capability, raise questions not about survival alone, but about control, alignment, and unintended consequences. None of these risks exist in isolation. They compound, they interact. They amplify one another in ways that resist simple modeling. If the pattern observed in previous civilizations holds, then danger does not come from repeating the last catastrophe. It comes from failing to recognize the next one. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson of the 6 prior ruptures. Each civilization was undone, not by the threat it expected, but by the one it was unprepared for. Coastal societies did not anticipate the sea's slow advance. Early farmers did not plan for centuries-long drought. Bronze Age empires did not imagine that trade networks could become liabilities rather than strengths. The 7th civilization faces a similar challenge, but at a different scale. We are preparing, often imperfectly, for known risks. We track asteroids, we model climate, we monitor disease, yet our systems remain optimized for short-term stability rather than long-term resilience. Political cycles favor immediate returns. Economic incentives reward efficiency over redundancy. Infrastructure is designed for expected conditions, not extreme deviation. If this hypothesis is correct, then the greatest threat is not ignorance, but misalignment. A civilization capable of understanding risk, yet structurally unable to act on that understanding at the timescales required. The earlier patterns suggest that survival favors flexibility, diversity, and decentralization. Populations that endured past disruptions were those that could change subsistence strategies, relocate, and reorganize social structures. Redundancy mattered. So did cultural memory. In contrast, modern civilization has concentrated functions into fewer systems. Fewer crops feed more people. Fewer energy sources power more activity. Fewer data centers store more knowledge. This concentration increases efficiency, but it also narrows margins for error. Seen through this lens, the question of whether we are truly the 7th civilization becomes secondary. What matters is whether we behave like one, whether we recognize that the pattern is not destiny, but warning, that awareness, without adaptation, changes nothing. The past does not predict the future, but it constrains it. The 6th rupture narrowed humanity's social possibilities. The 7th has expanded them again, but at the cost of unprecedented exposure. Never before has so much depended on so little going wrong. The pattern does not end with us. Patterns do not end, they evolve, and the next layer has not yet settled. Eventually, every world becomes quiet. Not all at once, and not everywhere, but gradually, as activity slows and structures lose their purpose, streets fill with dust, roofs collapse inward, names are forgotten. What remains is not drama, but sediment. Thin layers laid down year after year, waiting for someone else to notice them. This is how the past reaches us. Not as a warning shouted across time, but as a whisper preserved by chance. If there is a final lesson in the long sequence of civilizational ruptures, it is not that collapse is inevitable. It is that continuity is conditional. Each civilization believed, in its own way, that it had solved the problem of survival. Each had good reasons for that belief. And each was wrong in ways that only became obvious afterward. The people who survived past disruptions were not those with the most elaborate monuments or the greatest wealth. They were those who retained flexibility, those who could move, those who could abandon familiar systems when those systems no longer worked. Survival favored adaptation over permanence, memory over pride. What was carried forward was never everything. Knowledge thinned. Skills vanished. Entire ways of understanding the world disappeared. Yet something always crossed the boundary. Seeds, stories, techniques, patterns of thought, enough to begin again. We like to imagine ourselves as different, more advanced, more prepared. In some ways, we can detect risks that were invisible to our ancestors. We can preserve information in forms designed to outlast generations. We can see the pattern forming beneath our feet. But awareness is not resilience. Resilience requires choices made before necessity forces them. It requires redundancy where efficiency would be cheaper. It requires patience in systems built for speed. And it requires accepting that survival may mean becoming smaller, simpler, or slower than we would prefer. If another rupture comes, and history suggests that one eventually will, it will not ask whether we were intelligent, it will ask whether we were adaptable. One day, far in the future, someone may stand over a trench cut into the remains of our cities. They will note a boundary. A change in materials, a shift in how people lived. They may wonder what happened here, why one way of life ended, and another began. What they find will depend on what we choose to leave behind. The next layer has not yet formed. but it is already being written, and when it settles, quietly, it will tell a story.